So I am Celia, and I'm the Community Engagement Specialist at the Missoula Public Library. So I just want to take a quick second to welcome you all here. Thank you for being here as we celebrate two things having to do with Chris LaTray. One of them is that he is the William Kittredge Distinguished Visiting Writer at the University of Montana, and the other is that he was a recent winner of the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award. So both really, yes, exactly. Super, super awesome. So very quickly, thank you to MCAT, who is recording this evening as part of their community grant program. Thank you also to our besties over at Fact and Fiction, who are here selling books this evening. And I do want to remind you that after this program, there is a reception taking place at Fact and Fiction, where there will be free drinks and fun, some shenanigans, and also that's where they're going to actually award Chris his Pacific Northwest Bookseller Award. So if y'all want to take a trek just a few blocks down over to Fact and Fiction, that will start as soon as Chris gets over there. So part of that is that he's probably not going to do that much signing of books here. That will mostly take place at Fact and Fiction so that he can actually make it to his own party. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mark Sundin, from a writer also, and from the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Montana. So thank you.
Thank you. How's that? Yeah? All right, thank you all for being here. Thanks Fact and Fiction for having books. On my way in, I was handed this, which is another Fact and Fiction event coming up. I'm going to make a pitch for it. It is the book called The Essential Book of Pickup Trucks by Fred Hafley, May 4th. And this book is so good, I happen to know because I got to read it before it was published. And as it turns out, Fred was my undergraduate writing teacher. He taught me everything I know. He's over here somewhere. And I'm so inspired by you, Fred, because you're like 80 and you're still writing great books. I would love to do that. Yeah. Anyway, as mentioned, I'm Mark Sundin, and I teach environmental writing at the University of Montana. And one of the pleasures of my job is every year I get to choose, along with my colleagues, the Kittredge Distinguished Visiting Writer. And this has now been going on since 2003. Believe it or not, the first Kittredge writer was Kittredge himself. And since then, we've had a long string of luminaries, including Terry Tempest Williams and Rebecca Solnit and Rick Bass and David James Duncan, who I just saw somewhere in here. There he is. And more recently, Sierra Crane Murdoch and LaTray Graham, Amy Irvine. Of course, Chris this year. And next year, I'm now authorized to announce the visiting writer will be Therese Marie Milo, who is a First Nations author from Canada who wrote the absolutely stunning memoir called Heartberries. So she'll be here next year. All right, so a little bit about Chris, the 22nd visiting writer in this program. As far as I know, Chris is the first of those 22 to actually be born and raised in Missoula County. I believe, I did not get my introduction fact-checked, but, so any exaggerations or errors I will own. I believe Chris might be the first enrolled member of a tribal nation to hold this position, being the, in his case, a member of the Little Shel tribe of Chippewa Indians. And when I first started talking to Chris about taking this position, I asked, have you been to doing MFA programs or grad school in writing? And he goes, no, I didn't actually finish college at all. And I think you might be the first Kittredge writer to not have attended college. And this might seem like a strange thing to boast about at a university event, but as I will arrive at, I think it's important. Chris is and has always been outside the academic publishing world and the establishment. And I think that's the reason that his voice is so crucial and critical right now. Solitude and being an outsider is sometimes how a writer finds their voice. And sometimes being a part of a scene causes all the members of it to imitate each other, a sort of a groupthink that doesn't always make for good writing. And I'm going to propose that there's no big scene in Frenchtown, which is where Chris is from. So he had to find his voice more or less on his own. He's taken an unusual and admirable path to becoming the state's Poet Laureate. He grew up, shall we say, in the suburbs of Frenchtown, where his dad worked at the Smurfit Stone plant for 40 years. His dad was native but denied his heritage for reasons that are deeply explored in Chris's memoir, Becoming Little Shel. In one memorable scene, Chris attends a family funeral and wonders, who are all these Indians around here? He didn't know growing up. Anyway, he left Montana as a teenager with long hair and a bass guitar, headed to Seattle to find fame and fortune in, I believe, a hair metal band. Would that be accurate? As he explains that he missed the boat showing up in tight leather just as grunge arrived and ripped jeans and loose flannel shirts took over. Anyway, decades later, Chris is working as what he called a soul-sucking job that paid the bills, but he wasn't content. He loved writing, reading, and telling stories, and as he approached age 50, having never published, he quit the job and began writing. He took a job selling books here at Fact and Fiction. He began a practice of writing a single sentence each day, and this turned into his award-winning first book, The One-Sentence Journal, Short Poems and Essays from the World at Large, which won the 2018 Montana Book Award and the 2019 High Plains Book Award. His second book was a collection of haiku and haibun poetry, establishing him as Montana's cross between Basho and Charles Bukowski, if you can imagine that. He began teaching writing in the schools and also on wilderness river trips with the Free Flow Institute. He began to discover his own indigenous heritage, to meet his extended family. And then he got a call from Greg Gianforte. And let's just say that Chris and Greg don't always seem to share the same politics. But instead of being sent to a re-education camp, he was asked to be Poet Laureate of the great state of Montana. So. Shortly after that, he got a less momentous call from me, asking him to be the Kittredge visiting writer. And then last year, Milkweed Editions published his memoir, Becoming Little Shel, A Landless Indian's Journey Home, which I assume he's going to tell us a little more about tonight. Chris's writing is so important today. He writes about the land and our relationship to it and his personal love of it, of Western Montana, but also about the brutal history of it, the broken treaties and boarding schools and allotment, through which settlers not only stole the land from the native people, but also tried to erase their culture and identity. I should mention he's been described in print. Well, first of all, he brands himself with his newsletter as an irritable métis, and he's been described in print as a great teacher who is, at baseline, grumpy and hard to please. And I think this is also important. Because in his work, we see that the relationship between humans and land can't be properly understood without first examining the ownership of land, the forced removal of native people by whites, and the continuing repercussions of that. With his peripatetic background and his late-in-life start as a writer, LaTray may seem an unlikely literary hero, but I'd argue that his path was the singular and necessary training to step up to speak truth in these troubled times. Here he is, Chris LaTray.
Bonjour, Indinwe Maganadug. Hello, all of my relatives. I have never been more on the edge of my seat to know in wonderment what the next word out of my introducer's mouth was going to be. And I'm really wondering, who said I was grumpy and hard to please? Thank you. My mother just raised her hand. God, I feel like... That's right. I did see that before. Well, I'm not going to start in with my bloviations yet because I've been, very grateful the last two events I've done here at the library, which seems like it was like 6 weeks ago and then 6 weeks before that, to have begun our time together with drum groups from the Flathead Reservation. And it's beautiful. So I wanted to do something beautiful tonight as well. And as a Métis person, we are drums on Saturday, preceded by fiddles on Friday. So I would like to invite, for your pleasure, and especially mine, my good friend Sapphire Jetty, who is Spirit Lake, Dakota, and Turtle Mountain, Chippewa, and my friend and relative. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Like he said, I'm of Indigenous descent, and I'm also of French-Canadian descent, which makes me a Métis person. And for those of you who don't know, and Chris will talk a lot more about it, I'm sure, Métis is a word that means mixed, and that's the style that goes into the fiddle that I'm about to play. It's an influence, it has really rhythmic influences from Indigenous music, and then the Celtic and French-Canadian influences from the music that French fur trappers would play. So I'm going to start off with a Métis classic. It's called Whiskey Before Breakfast. And I may or may not throw in a tune I learned just this afternoon, and it's called Gray Owl. All right. Should I mic, or can you guys in the back hear me okay? Okay. next tune I'm going to play is called 5 Miles from Town. It's actually an old time tune, but I had the pleasure of learning it from Bruce Molsky, who's a musician. He does like a ton of old time stuff, but he's really known for his bowing. And a lot of his bowing style is super similar to the stuff that you'll find in Métis music. It's really rhythmic and kind of choppy, and it makes you want to dance, which is the whole idea of the style. This tune is called Old Paint. It's a waltz, and I'm switching to a cross tuning right now, which is a super common thing that Métis fiddlers and old-time fiddlers will do, where they'll put their fiddle in a completely different tuning to play a tune. So it sounds a little different than a normal standard tune might. All right, I got a couple more tunes for you. This next one's a French-Canadian classic that a lot of fur trappers would play. It's called Hangman's Reel, and it's got 5 parts to it. So bear with me. I'm going to end out with a tune that I wrote a few years ago here in Missoula. It's a medley of jigs, and it's got some Métis influence, but it also has a lot of Celtic influence, which is something I just can't seem to shy away from. So you'll hear even in my Métis music, I kind of have this like Celtic accent, like the little trills that I'll do on my fiddle, but I decided I'll just lean into it, lean into the like cultural mixture of music that I have going on in my fiddle here. So these tunes are called Garden Jigs. Thank you so, so much, and thanks, Chris, for having me again. It was super fun. We got to do an event together last December in Helena for the Winter Lodge Rendezvous, so that was super fun, so it's great to be back, and thanks so much.
Sapphire Jetty. Who's ready to just go home now? I mean, what a beautiful evening with all of this behind us and that music. In indigenous cultures, we have a lot of traditions. It's what defines us is our traditions. And we have bundle carriers. Bundles are collections of medicines. Like you'll have a beaver bundle for beaver medicine. You'll have different ones. We have pipe carriers. Pipes are our relatives. They're spirits. Drums. Dewayagan is the Ojibwe word for a drum. It means the instrument that makes the sound of the heart. That fiddle is a bundle. And Sapphire is a bundle carrier. Because like so many things, our music is in peril. Because there's just not that many people playing that old-time Métis fiddle music. And what a beautiful thing that it is someone so young who has decided to take it upon herself to pick that bundle up that somebody else set aside on the way. And I'm just very grateful for that. I'm less grateful for all of the bad jokes I know that have come out of the mouth of her father, Mike Jetty, who works for the Office of Public Instruction in the Indian Ed Department. He is the worst carrier of dad joke bundles, possibly in the history of North America. As an example, how do you call attention to a canoe load of Little Shel people passing on the river? Ahoy, Métis. You know why you never see buffalo hiding in the trees? Because they're really good at it. Mike Jetty, ladies and gentlemen. Curiously, the first time I encountered Mark Sundin's work as a writer, so I was a fan before any of this, was at a panel at the Montana Festival of the Book at the Holiday Inn many, many years ago, and he was on a panel with Steve Rinella and Fred Hafley and some other dude. Do you remember that? Yeah, it was that long ago. So it's funny, is I always tell students, or people in panels who ask me, what's the best advice for young writers? I say, don't be an asshole. Because the world is small, and we all know each other, and we all talk, and if there's anything that you don't want to precede you, it's a bad reputation. So I'm very, very grateful to be here, to be invited to do all of these wonderful things that never would have happened if not for that first book, One Sentence Journal, which came out on August 14th, 2018, and people started calling me a poet, which wasn't something I'd ever aspired to be. It just happened to be a book that happened to have poems in it. And people said, well, now you're a poet. And I'm like, well, that's cool enough for me because nobody cares about poets. It's kind of subversive. And I took that on and started doing more and more events related to that. It was August 14th, 2023, 5 years to the day of that book came out that Governor Gianforte called me and said he was appointing me Montana State Poet Laureate. So it's one of those kind of synchronicities in the world that have been part of this whole incredibly wonderful run I've been on of opportunities for publishing books and getting to talk all over the state. Yesterday I was in Bozeman. This morning I was in Superior. Tomorrow I'll be in Havre, and after that I'll be in Virginia City. It's just one thing after another. And people say, isn't it exhausting? And it's joyously exhausting. Because what a chance it is to get out and get in front of people who would never have heard the story of who we are if people like me and Nicholas Vroom, people for the future like Sapphire weren't out there spreading what it means to be Métis, what it means to be this people who are not recognized at all by the United States of America. We didn't cross the border crossed us. And one of my favorite things in the last decade is how many people are beginning to recognize their Métis heritage and own it and begin to identify as Métis. And what a wonderful circumstance that is for the people who never got a chance to own that. So my friend James Vukolich Kagegabo, who is Turtle Mountain also, and is an Anishinaabe kind of culture and language educator, talks about when we heal ourselves, we heal our ancestors as much as we provide healing for the opportunities for the people to come after us. So I feel like the more people who embrace where we come from and who we are and what it means to stand together as a combination of everything that came before us, we're not just healing ourselves. We are healing everything we've ever been and everything we're ever going to be. So that's what I tell students. Or high school students and elementary school students in particular. Like when I'm in front of you, I am the combination of every person who's ever been part of my life and every decision they ever made to ensure that I could exist, that I could survive in the face of whatever came at us. So I am the result of my father and my grandfather denying our Native history because they didn't want me to suffer the way they did for owning or even trying to own who they were. So they live in me. Just like that great, however many great grandmothers it was, who realized it was a good idea for the future of her family and her community to marry that sweaty, bearded French guy who stepped out of a canoe with a big red feather in his hat and said, I wanted to trade. And she said, okay, let's get married and let's talk beaver pelts for guns. And that's funny, but that's where the Métis people began. And I am related to that woman. So now I stand here with all of that churning in me, and I can decide on their decisions, what are necessary to hang on to, and what is necessary to let go of for the continuation of the future. And what I'm going to let go of is that shame for being who we are. And I'm going to carry the pride of my ancestry, not for myself, but for my father and my grandfather and all of those people who were forced by colonial influence to have to abandon it. So I am very joyful when I see someone like Sapphire, who is the next generation on, doing the same thing. I had a plan and I've already abandoned it. That was all stuff I was going to talk about after I did a little bit of reading. But here we are. I'm going to read, I wanted to read something different from what I've been reading for the last year from this book. And I'm going to read a part about my friend Al Wiseman, who is an elder who lives in Shodo, Montana. And he is a direct descendant of the people who established a Métis community in the Teton Canyon just above Shodo. And this begins kind of in the middle of a scene where we have just gone up and visited. There's an old Métis cemetery within view of the cabin where Joseph Quincy Howard wrote his book about the Métis. So he lived up right next to where this settlement was, going back as early as the 1860s, we know for sure, but Al's pretty certain that they were there even before that. So Al keeps this cemetery, and he is a knowledge carrier of who we are and where we come from. From the settlement clearing, Al leads the way along a short path that winds through brittle shrubs and aspens up a short hill to the old Métis cemetery. Halfway up, he stops and points to a spot high on the hillside. You see that outcropping there, he asks. They, the Métis community, would always have a lookout up there after the government started rounding the people up and shipping them to Canada. If anyone started coming up the canyon, they'd race down and let the people know, and everyone would scatter. The cemetery is a small, sloping, rectangular place with several grave markers. The grass, what there is of it, is cropped short. Al, the caretaker here, has constructed not only a split rail fence surrounding the area, but also a rough-hewn replica of a Red River cart. A signboard identifies who's buried where. It's beautiful and peaceful. Aspens with mottled, glowing white bark surround it on three sides. It is sublime in its beauty, quiet except for the rattling of the bright green aspen leaves. Al tells the story of an old woman he knew when he was growing up. She had come down from Canada after the Northwest Rebellion of 1885, after it became too dangerous to stay. A Métis settlement on the American side of the Medicine Line, west of the town of Depouilleur, she called Little Chicago, was already there, and her family decided to head for it. This woman and her family came down and had 10 head of stock with them, Al says. They only traveled at night, and they traveled in Red River carts. That's one of the few people I ever talked to who ever traveled in one. I think she told me she was 6 years old. She never did say what they ate along the way because what do you carry? So I asked her one time, what did you do for food? She dropped her head and said, Al, I don't like to talk about this, but we ate a lot of gophers. Al tears up as he relates the story. It took them 3 months to complete their journey to Little Chicago, he says. The family ended up in Teton Canyon. I often think of this stuff, you know, Al says. If it hadn't been for their will, none of us would be here. Al Weisman was born in Choteau, one of 5 children. His father was a German from Indiana, and his mother was Métis. The family moved from Choteau just down the road south to Gilman, near Augusta, when he was 2 or 3. Growing up, there were plenty of Indian kids around and plenty of mixed-race kids, too. Some were sent to boarding schools and came back changed. Boarding school kids were disconnected. They didn't know who they were, Al says, so they turned to alcohol and drugs. His mother made sure her children knew where they came from, but there were limits. For example, Al doesn't speak Michif or any of the other languages, Cree maybe, or Ojibwe, that the Teton Canyon people spoke. The older people wouldn't teach the language to the kids, Al says. Old folks would be in the cabin visiting, playing cards, and the kids would come to the window and listen to try and learn. But they didn't want the kids to know. He understands why and doesn't blame the older folks. Think of the boarding schools, of the punishment Indian children endured for merely speaking the languages of their ancestors. When you get burnt or hurt, or however you want to say when you're young, you don't want to pass that on because you don't want your kids to go through what you went through, he says. If children don't know it, they can't be punished for knowing it. Al had his share of encounters with anti-Indian racism too. He tells me a story from when he entered high school in Augusta and signed up for a class taught by an instructor from Fort Benton. It wasn't unusual for what all Native children experienced growing up. There was quite a few mixed blood kids in the school, but in this particular class, I was the only one, he says. I took Spanish. Don't ask me why, because I don't know. But at this time, anything about Indian culture I could have benefited from was taboo, you know? No one even liked to say the word Indian. Anyway, I take Spanish, and I didn't last too many days in there. This teacher would come by and just bypass me. He wouldn't even look at me. I think it was the 3rd day maybe, and he came by and he stopped at my desk and he says, Al, I don't know what you're doing in this class. And I thought to myself, I don't know what I'm doing here either. I don't think you Indian kids would understand anything about Spanish. You know, the best thing you could do is go back to the reservation where you came from. I said, I don't know anything about any reservation. I've never been on one in my life. I've only heard about them. I'm not from a reservation. I live right down the street here. The next day, I didn't go back to his class. Al had seen the older generations go out and make a living doing manual labor and figured he could too. So at 16, he quit school and got a job doing carpentry for a local builder. I went to a guy here in town who was a pretty good-sized builder, and I said, "Bob, I never finished high school and I don't have much education, but I'm willing to work." And he said, "By God, that's what I'm looking for, and I'm willing to teach." I lost my place. "You've got a job." I worked for him for years. In the 1950s, when Al was drafted into the Army, Bob said he could get him deferred. But many of Al's friends had joined the Army, and he knew veterans who had gone to World War I and World War II, so he couldn't stay behind. Al put in 2 years in Korea, then came back and went to work with Bob again right away. "The last 22 years of my working life, I run my own business," Al says, and he beams with pride. Al's wife, Elaine, a beautiful, kind, and soft-spoken woman who constructs a mean Spam sandwich, has been part of that business too, handling the books and keeping things on track. Her family has deep ties to Teton Canyon and to the Little Shel, with her family roots in the Turtle Mountains. "I honestly never heard the word Métis until recent years," Elaine says. "As I was growing up, I knew I was Indian, but I can't remember my dad, my grandma, anyone saying Métis. Chippewa and Cree is what I was raised up hearing. I guess I'm Métis, but I never heard of it." Elaine says both of her parents were very quiet. Her mother also lost her own mother at a very young age, so she didn't learn anything to pass along. "From the time I was little, we used to go to landless Indian meetings in Great Falls," she says. "Other than that, nothing." Al Wiseman learned what he knows from growing up around it. There was never any concentrated study. It was just a matter of living, as he says. The Métis were forced out of the canyon by homesteaders assisted by the U.S. Army and assimilated to varying degrees into the surrounding communities. Many who could pass for white did, if only to make their lives and the lives of their children easier. Others had to get along as best they could. All these people are the ones Al Wiseman grew up beside, and there aren't many left who can, or are willing to, tell the story the way Al can. "I've known this stuff all along, but I never stepped out with it or anything," he says. "I didn't learn this stuff overnight. I lived it. I heard these old people talk and was always interested in it. I figured I better try and do something here because our older people were so reserved you wouldn't get much out of them. Especially if you were non-Indian, they wouldn't tell you much because they didn't trust you. Why should they have?" 2 years into this book, and reflecting on my dad's life as part of a family that absolutely experienced the scattering, the diaspora of our extended relatives from the lands that defined them, a thought occurs to me for the first time. It manifests as I write and reflect on the stories Al Wiseman told me of his life. Because my dad is no longer someone I can see and connect with physically, there's an image of him that lives in my head. It's not the older version of him, the one who finally declined after decades of poor health and alcohol abuse. It's the robust man I always counted on when I was younger. The version of him that's about the age I am now, 30 years younger, healthy, and something of a force of nature. The reality is, he isn't my contemporary. If he appeared again before me, he would be of Al Wiseman's generation. Al is less than 4 years my dad's senior. They could have been classmates. When Al was 16 and leaving high school, my dad was 13, already drinking beer and smoking cigarettes and tinkering on cars. Both men left high school early. Al to work as a carpenter, then the Army, then back to work, and my dad to the Navy, and then back to work. But man, did things go separate directions when it comes to how they were raised, how they were encouraged to stay connected to their ancestors. It seems that Al's Indian mother passed down a measure of pride for where he came from that he was able to connect with. My grandmother is the only person I recall from my family who openly talked about being Chippewa, and I don't know much of what her relationship with my dad was like. Perhaps my despotic grandfather forbid such sharing. I know he physically and emotionally abused my dad. My dad was constantly berated as worthless and stupid, so my mom tells me, both of which he absolutely was not. What if my father had received some encouragement? What if his family had remained closer in proximity to the LaTrays and Doneys so there was some kind of community around him for a larger percentage of his life? People sharing the experience of being Indian in the 50s and 60s and 70s and watching each other's backs. What kind of difference would it have made? This disconnect and shame is what happens when communities are broken up, when connections are lost and rituals and rites of passage aren't practiced. My dad loved his immediate family, my mom, my sisters, and me, and his own parents, I guess, unless his time with them was merely him doing what he thought of as his duty, since he was the only one close by. In her bleaker moments, my mother tells me she never felt part of the LaTray family, that she was assured by both my father and his parents that this was the case. But I also know how bad my entire family is at being close, not just to others, but to one another. I talk to my mom fairly regularly, but I can count my interactions with my sisters on one hand every year. My mom is now estranged from her family too, near as I can tell. I haven't seen any of them for years. So there's only the four of us to be connected, and we just not really are. It doesn't seem weird to me because I don't know any different, but maybe it is. This all stems from the generations stacked up against us who chose to disavow where they came from so future generations wouldn't have to endure what they did. We can't be angry about that either because they were as trauma-struck as we are. We have to have compassion for what they endured, no matter how angry it made them, and try to be the generations where the disconnect ends. But it's hard when you don't know any different. Al Wiseman and his wife, Elaine, are true Métis elders. And their value to our community is immeasurable. But they're members of just one community. Certainly there are others scattered about with the rest of our Métis relations with similar stories to tell. Maybe stories they've never told at all, like the boarding school survivors my Turtle Mountain friend Denise Lajimedier talks about. One benefit I'd like to see from a Little Shel federal recognition is that it would hopefully give more people the courage to open up about their experiences. That might help people heal, whether they're like my dad, who had his pride from where he came from tormented out of him, or maybe people like me, who never had a chance to celebrate that part of who we are. When you talk to elders, you'll hear different things, Al Wiseman tells me. What I'm not saying this is the only way it was, because it's not. You get outside of this territory, my own people did things a little differently. What they had in common is they banded together and formed enclaves on the outer edges of the newly forming settler communities and had to make a go of it on their own. All those familial, matrilineal ties that created a web of community across distances were stretched near to breaking, but they endured, if quietly and largely underground. Importantly, the people survived, and with them stories like Al's. That's what's important, because sometimes when it comes to the long game, the people who hold out, whatever it takes, often come out ahead. I've seen a lot of stuff, Al Wiseman says. I heard a lot of stuff, both personal and not personal stuff. I carry it here, he says, pointing at his heart, and I will until I die. So that's Al Wiseman. And as I was reading that, thank you. As I was reading that, I was thinking about a high school student, I think it was in Bozeman the other day, asked me about my dad. Because I was telling about how, Grandma said we were Chippewa and Dad said we weren't. And I like to tell kids, if Grandma says one thing and Dad says the other, who are you going to believe? Well, if you're smart, you believe Grandma, because Grandma's the boss. And literally, that's funny, but also it's true, because if it wasn't for the women in our culture, maintaining those kinship ties, we would know nothing about it. And if my grandma hadn't been openly proud of being Chippewa and assuring me that I was Chippewa too, I never would have known about it. I'd never be here. I may have actually ended up a rock star, which was my ultimate goal. But this student asked me, how did your dad feel about your grandma talking about you being Chippewa? And it occurred to me that in many households, my father might have been like adamantly opposed to her even saying that. And he just let it go. He didn't want to talk about it, but clearly he didn't make an issue of grandma talking about it. And how could things have been different if he'd been a hard ass? And by not being that, it gave me an opening to remain who I was and to ultimately find out who we are. So in that way, I feel like Dad did play a role in protecting where we come from, even if he could not bring himself to be directly related to that preservation. Does anybody have any questions? Or comments? Oh, come on. Am I like with 8th graders again? Yes, in the very back.
Is there something that you discovered when you were on this journey that totally surprised you, that you never would have thought would have made it something?
Is there something I discovered on this journey that I imagine I never would have known otherwise? Two things. Number one, and I was having this conversation with Darnell and Smokey Rides at the Door this morning up because they were in Spokane, Superior as well. Just the deep relationships among tribes and how we have blood kin relationships all across the Northern Plains. So the colonizer wants to establish that everybody lived in their own boxes and never interacted, and we were all just a bunch of savages running around looking for someone to count coup on. And that wasn't the case. You know, we lived in this thriving place full of magnificent non-human relatives that we all had to figure out a way to share and exist together and sometimes work together to survive. So there are Azures and Donies and stuff on the Blackfeet Reservation and on Fort Peck and Fort Belknap and on the Flathead Reservation, just like there are people with their surnames living in our community. We've been related for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and part of our, dysfunction is the result of colonial power trying to keep us separate. So when we are in community, as we always have been, we are mighty. And not knowing that was a big revelation for me. So that's number one. And number two, I had no idea just how deeply badass the Métis were as buffalo hunters. Our buffalo brigades were the most powerful buffalo hunting economy on the Northern Plains for 100 years. And I think that's pretty awesome. A Canadian had to tell me that, because all that scholarship comes out of Canada. Yes, Mark.
You were just talking about Métis people being deported across into Canada and
Uh-huh.
having citizenship. I just wondered what you learned that's parallel to today's border and people being deported.
Yeah, so Mark's talking about the Cree Deportation Act of 1896, is when the United States allocated $5,000 for the Army, and curiously, it was the 10th Cavalry, which was the Buffalo soldiers who were stationed at Fort Assiniboine in Havre. So it was the Black Regiment, led by Black Jack Pershing. Only it wasn't Black Jack, it was a more colorful term that we don't say anymore, thankfully. But that's what he was known as because he was the leader of the 10th Cavalry. And they were charged with rounding up any Indians who weren't on reservations, and they were identified as Canadian Indians. Well, you're largely talking about us as Métis people and a lot of Nakota, Assiniboine people who had not taken up residence on the reservations. So all those people were rounded up and deported to Canada. And that happened, and we just came back. And it was a huge failure. So fast forward 160 years or whatever to February of 2025, and that current jackass residing in that horrible place decides that they're going to start deporting people. And you saw it in the newspapers locally where tribal governments, Fort Peck, Fort Belknap, the Blackfeet Reservation, were urging their citizens to make sure and carry your tribal ID at all times because of the risk of being deported. And there's like 8 or 10 dudes in Missoula that I think all they do is sit around and comment on every article that the Missoulian posts. And they were talking about, oh, they would never do that. That's such a dumb article. Why would they even consider that? These Missoulian people need to get new jobs, just the usual shit. And it's the same stuff that you can see in newspapers from 100 years ago, only they're talking about us. But the thing is that deportation isn't just hypothetical, it's real. It happened here. And there are people alive who were connected to people that it actually happened to. So like my great-grandmother was born in 1896. So depending if I was a little older, I could have known someone who was part of a group of people who were rounded up and deported to Canada. And what's funny is a couple of years ago, remember when we had the wonderful dedication of Bear Tracks Bridge here in Missoula? The Missoulian ran a photograph and they originally captioned it. Here's an actual photograph of the Salish being marched across Higgins Bridge on their way north to the Flathead Reservation. And people were like, well, no, the bridge wasn't there. They crossed on horseback. The photo was actually from 5 years later in 1896 when a bunch of Métis people were rounded up and put in Fort Missoula, as well as a few French tourists who were like living the wrong place, wrong time nightmare of international travel. And that was a photograph of them. And if you zoomed in on it, you could actually see Red River carts, which for those who don't know, I mentioned it in what I read. The Red River cart is a Métis invention that is considered by most historians as the first evidence of wheel use by indigenous people on the Northern Plains. So an anthropologist came to our part of the country and they were like, you people are so primitive, you don't even use the wheel. Well, up until we moved out onto the plains, we didn't need the wheel because we had this marvel of technology called the birch bark canoe that remains a marvel of technology for how you can build it off the land and it carries a lot of weight and it's light and durable. Well, once we moved chasing those buffalo out on the plains, we needed wheels. So a couple Métis guys invented the Red River cart, which is this 2-wheeled conveyance that the wheels would pop off so you could float it across a river if you had to. You could repair it on the go, and each one of those could carry 900 pounds. So you take 100 of those carts out to the front range of the Rocky Mountains, or you take 300, or you take 1,000, which we would do. We would move entire towns out onto the plains with our cattle, which we also were the first to introduce into the Northern Plains. Set up a little town, and then these mighty dudes would ride out and kill buffalo, and we would process them and bring them back as hides and pemmican. Pemmican being the most valuable trade item on the Northern Plains for a long period. And that's where we solidified our role as the go-to economy for buffalo products. I hate using the language I'm using because it's so capitalist, but that's what it was. And that's who we were. We were these mighty buffalo hunters. Anybody else? Yes, in the way back.
The whole process of researching and writing and talking about the book, do you have a favorite experience and what was hardest about it?
Favorite experience writing a book and what was hardest about it? I think my favorite experience is just we live in a spectacular place, Montana and the Northern Plains. Just getting to say I'm working while driving across the High Line, and all of these things. That's my favorite thing, is going out and seeing the land and connecting to it and the people who are also connected in that respect. So just the going around and seeing people and learning things is probably the best part. The hardest part was realizing at one point that because of meeting those people and hearing those stories is the moment I realized this wasn't just my story. That I was carrying the story for all those people who it wasn't safe to own their story. And I felt and regularly feel, at risk of sounding more white-lighty than I would care to admit to being, I feel those presences. I feel those spirits. I feel selected by them to tell this story. And the responsibility that I feel to get it right and to tell it well was far beyond what I anticipated when I sat down writing it. And for all of you writers in the room, I know you have moments where you're writing and it's like, you know what? I'm going to call tomorrow and I'm going to start putting together my bespoke leather and fur tuxedo for the National Book Awards. And then the next day, it's like, you know, Wendy's is paying $18 an hour. That doesn't sound too bad. It's that back and forth. And then the pressure of just wanting to get the stories right. That's the hard part. I don't think that's any different from any other writer. Just want to get the story right. Because it becomes a thing bigger than just words on a page. Anyone else? Yes.
What do you tell young people who have Métis ancestry from a few generations back and they're blonde-haired, blue-eyed, feel like they want to embrace her yet, but maybe you just don't look like it, they might not be accepted? My daughter.
Yeah. So the question is, what do I tell young people who have Métis ancestry but don't feel like they look Indian enough and they're hesitant to connect to it? Is that essentially what you're asking? Yeah, it's hard because the lateral violence in Native communities is terrible. Even if you look Indian, if you're not dark enough, it's one of the ways that we have been most viciously colonized is the generation of the lateral violence that we inflict on each other. And that is very difficult to overcome. And you ask, I say this all the time, and I'm sure half the room has heard me say this, you ask 10 Indians a question, you get 8 different answers, and the other 2 argue why the other 9 aren't even Indians. I mean, that's kind of hyperbolic, but it's true. You know, we don't have to look like anything. I blame Charlie Russell for single-handedly making the entire world think that every Indian looks like an extra from Dances with Wolves. And the truth is we don't. We look like everybody. And we would have arrived in this place without colonialism if we'd managed to live together instead of that narrow band of the population setting us all against each other and acting with murderous intent. So it's not like where we are today as far as how we appear would have been any different. I was in Iowa City on part of my book tour, and it was homecoming day for the Iowa Hawkeyes football team. And she was there thinking she was going to hear poetry, and she was kind of shit-faced. And at the end of the thing, she was like, I expected poetry, and you don't even look like an Indian. And I said, well, what's an Indian supposed to look like? She said, I don't know, I'd think you'd be more tan or something. Well, what do you say? I said, I've been in a car a lot. I don't get out in the sun as much this summer as I would like to. But then I held up my book and my face, and that tintype, which at times I really struggle that my face is on it, but this was a time I was proud of it. Because if you take that picture and you use Photoshop and you superimpose that into a photograph of all those Métis guys who died fighting the Canadians alongside Louis Riel, it would fit perfectly. So when I look at that picture, I see my ancestors appearing in my face. That doesn't really answer your question. But what I tell them is, who cares what you look like? You are what you are, and you can own it. And there are people who will back you up. These communities, not everybody's like that. They are very welcoming. The Turtle Mountain people have been very welcoming to me. There's a place for your daughter. She just needs to take it. In the vac. Oh, geez, that's sapphire. Can you add to this? Please do. A mic magically appears. It's like we've done this before, Celia.
That really hits home for me because, like, as you can see, my mom's genetics are very strong. I look
basically nothing like my dad, so a lot of people are really surprised when I say, yeah, I'm Indigenous and I've been dancing at powwow since I was very little, and I've learned some of the Dakota language and all these old songs, and people go, wait, really? You are? And so something that my dad's always talked about is that there's no right or wrong way to be Indigenous. It's really about learning and honoring like your heritage and your history and the language. And something that he has always like made super present in my life is learning the language. Like he sung to me when I was in the womb, and like these super old prayer songs. And then like right as like basically as soon as I could walk and as long as I can remember, I've been dancing at powwows. I've done the jingle dress dance and like learned about all the history from it. And it's something that is like aligned super, super personally with me and the way that I've been raised and the way that I think about the world. And I think that that's what it really means, is like knowing who you are, knowing your connection to the places that you come from and the land that you're on. And there is no right or wrong way to be Indigenous or look Indigenous, and that's something that I hold very true to.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Who else?
you.
Yes.
Just to comment that when you were accepted into the tribe, that made me cry. It just touched me. And also the scene where you saw your name on a headstone. Because I remember I was 22 years old when I first saw my name on a headstone.
Mm-hmm.
And just that emotion, you wrote it beautifully.
Thank you. I'm not going to repeat that because I don't want to repeat people saying something really nice about me. I'm just going to be very grateful for it. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Is there going to be another Poet Laureate? Well, thank you for asking. Because we don't really know, right? Because by now, typically, we've already put out the call, the Arts Council, for nominations. And so I was nominated in 2021 and was a finalist, and I knew in the middle of April that I was a finalist. And here we are, staggering into May, and there isn't an announcement for who the finalists are because of this bullshit at the federal level and the cancellation of grants for the humanities. And the Arts Council is like on a week-to-week basis wondering when they're going to get ambushed. And they're the ones who are responsible for the Poet Laureate program. And that is, as I tell people all the time, stories, the reason they go after the humanities is because it's the stories that we share among ourselves that make us powerful. However those stories manifest. And like from Indigenous communities, when they realized how mighty we were in ceremony, they made it illegal for us to be in ceremony. And we couldn't practice our ceremonial traditions and our dances until 1978. It's like when we take for granted, like if I decided I was gonna go out to my car and get my little road case that I carry all of my smudge stuff in and started walking through here smudging all of you with sage, we take that for granted. You guys might think I'm a little weird, but I wouldn't get thrown in jail. But prior to 1978, I could have been, because that was illegal. So they come after this stuff. And what's happening right now is there are a lot of people who never thought that type of violence, because violence isn't just physical. Violence is many things, and what is happening to the humanities is violence. And there are many of us who got a little too comfortable in thinking that kind of violence would never reach us. And what we're seeing at the federal level is not an anomaly or an aberration. It is how the system has always been designed, which is to suck up all the wealth and power from us and give it to a very narrow band of wealthy and powerful. And that water has been rising. And now we're at this place where I'm actually enthusiastic, like the protests and all of the backlash that we have generated against what they're doing. When the humanities was canceled, when the grants were canceled, and all of my programs that I've been doing for humanities for years were canceled, I said, we're going to figure it out. I'm not canceling shit. And we've covered everything. Everything that I was scheduled to do is happening because people stepped up. I'd have done, yes. And that's not about me, that's about you. There is so much money out in the private sector to fund all this stuff. We need to redefine how we handle this. And I think it's happening. I think it can happen. I think there's momentum. We just have to be dedicated to it. And I use that as a metaphor for what we achieved as the Little Shel. We engaged in the long game, and we returned back time and time and again for more than 150 years. And we stuck at it. And people who figured they would never see the better world for their people that they were trying so hard to ensure, they did it anyway. And then the next people picked up the torch and took it a little farther and took it a little farther. And the irony is that we received our federal restoration as a part of a bill to fund the entire military industrial complex that has only tried to eradicate us from the very beginning, signed by probably the worst person to ever put a bad choice in footwear onto this earth. You know Trump wears shitty shoes. He's the one who signed it, but we'll take it because we can use it. And that long game that we engaged in is the long game that we need to be committed to as people who care about our communities. And I think we're up to it. Because if we could do it, and we are a shit show, the rest of us can do it. Any other questions? I almost called on you because if I'm in front of fourth graders and I say a hand move, I make them talk. I had to pull myself back from the brink. Anyone else? All right. Yes, in the back again. This guy's question. No. Yeah, I'm going to have another book of poetry come out. I'm working on another, in the early stages of another book of nonfiction. I asked Sapphire, we should record an album together, and we're going to do that. Like her music with my poetry. Yeah, there's no lack of ideas. I was going to say something else, but I forgot. What's your question?
Splitting versus lumping.
Splitting versus humping? Lumping. Okay. I was going to say, wow, we're getting away from that. Now the party's starting. We're not even at fact and fiction yet.
So, 40 plus years ago.
I'm horrified I just said that and then looked at my mom. So is she. Oh, what have I done? I'm sorry, your question.
So yeah, so the T, Little Shel, in your bio it says the Pembina band.
Uh-huh.
So 40 years ago I found myself in a situation where I was summarizing the literature from the Pembina River.
Okay.
And I'm just tell me about, go find. So, as we talk about what's our responsibility for protecting and for, I guess, telling the story of the smallest groups, where does the Pembina band fit into Little Shel?
So the question is, there's all these communities I throw around. Little Shel, Métis, and Pembina, the Pembina Chippewa. So Pembina is the Ojibwe word for high cranberry, which grows in abundance in that region, along the Pembina River, the Red River, the Turtle Mountains. And Pembina was a primary ingredient of what I talked about earlier, pemmican, which is one of the most valuable trade goods in the history of the Northern Plains. So it was some kind of dried meat. In our case, it was buffalo mixed with a bunch of fat and something to sweeten it up, some kind of berry, which for us for a long time was primarily Pembina. And it was so important to us that we were known as the Pembina Chippewa. So you can think of the Pembina Chippewa as kind of the southwestern edge of the vast territory that are all of the Anishinaabe people, which includes the Ojibwe people and the Chippewa, which are the same, different words for the same thing. So Anishinaabe is this umbrella under which multiple tribes exist who share cultural and language traditions. So the Pembina Chippewa are this western edge, and we know what our territory was because of the Sweet Corn Treaty in 1851, which was originally supposed to establish shared ground between us and the Dakota because we fought all the time. And it was from the Red River, which is the border today of so-called Minnesota and North Dakota, flows north into Manitoba, drains into Lake Winnipeg, which ultimately drains into Hudson's Bay. So it was the Red River to the east, all the way across what is now North Dakota into eastern Montana and south into South Dakota. So it was this vast territory of 9 million acres. And that's the Pembina Chippewa. So by the 1850s, that treaty was never ratified, but it kind of began like, okay, this is who these people are, and we're going to start taking away that land. So in 1883, the Pembina Chippewa become the Turtle Mountain Chippewa because the reservation of 450,000 acres is established to include the Turtle Mountains, which was imperative to the chief who was in charge at the time that these negotiations were happening, and that chief was named Little Shel. And he was the third Little Shel, because Little Shel is a hereditary title. And his real name was Ayabewewitung, which means he who rests on the way. So Little Shel is the guy in charge at the time of the creation of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa, which renames the Pembina Chippewa. And then 2 years later, they shrink the reservation 90% to 45,000 acres, which is what it is today. So in this vast territory, all that remains to us is this tiny little postage stamp of land. They didn't stop there because they wanted us to cede the rest of that land, which has never, and to this day, has not been ceded. And they come in 1892 with a plan to buy all of that land for 10 cents an acre. It was the Macomber Agreement, and it's known colloquially as the 10-cent treaty. And Little Shel, our Little Shel that we're named after, is still the guy in charge. And he recognizes that he has to sell some of that land, but he still wants to make sure we maintain land that includes some of the Turtle Mountains, because they're sacred to us. And they're mountains only by people who have never seen a real mountain, just so you know. And the result of that agreement not only establishes that 10-cent treaty, but also the feds recognize that Little Shel would never play ball, so they exclude him from the negotiations. They handpick a few people who will play ball with them and identify them as chiefs, which was part of the game plan by the United States for a couple hundred years. Like, pick for themselves who the chiefs are and dupe everybody else and have them sign for things that they're not even, I'm sorry, I keep pointing at you guys. And have someone who doesn't have the authority to sign things. And that's what happens. And Little Shel and anybody who follows him and anybody else that they decide they don't want in their community gets disenrolled. So they're no longer members of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa anymore, nor are Indians at this point allowed to be citizens of the United States either. So that's where the diaspora begins. And all these communities pop up where people are just trying to survive. And that goes on, and different factions send representatives to DC to try and lobby on our behalf to create a land base for us. One almost happened in the 1880s in central Montana, but didn't. And then 1978, the United States recognizes that there's hundreds of tribes who deserve to be federally recognized. So they put together a plan for how tribes can step by step become recognized, and it's very complex and difficult and almost impossible. So at that point, all of these scattered communities come together and become the Little Shel. And the Little Shel become into existence, named for the chief who got screwed. And that begins our official step-by-step effort to become federally recognized, and it ultimately pays off in 2019. So it began Pembina, and then Little Shel is like the reawakening of part of the Turtle Mountains, who were originally Pembina. Does that answer your question?
Yes. I appreciate the background of the history. Thank you.
Yeah.
I do see parallels, the more you divide people, the more you can single them out and treat them differently.
Oh, sure. Divide and conquer.
Game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right.
So, major companies, the trick is have people like yourself knitting us together, but still maintaining the separation, still to fight against the separation that moms that will be divided against each other.
The trick is to paddle out and sink all their ships before they even land. There's a joke, you know, why is May the least popular month in Indian communities? This is not a Mike Jetty joke. I heard this somewhere else. Because April showers bring May flowers. Get it? It does sound like a Mike Jetty joke. It might have been, but I filtered through somebody else. Anybody else? We got, one more. Yes. Uh-huh. So the question was, did I speak the Little Shel's language at the beginning? Which I did. It's Anishinaabe-Moan or Ojibwe-Moan. That is the language of the Ojibwe Anishinaabe people. And I think learning the language, which I do not know, I know a few words, a few phrases. I know who all the 7 grandfathers are who are tattooed on my forearm. But the preservation of indigenous languages is probably the most important thing I will work on for the rest of my life. So, you know, the United Nations predicts that in the next 100 years, 90% of the languages spoken in the world will be extinct. And ours is on that list. And we can't allow that to happen because the secrets for how we've survived for thousands and thousands and thousands of years lives in the language. And we have to preserve that. And there are efforts going on all over the country, all over the world in pursuit of that preservation. And I want to be part of it. Thank you for asking. Anyone else? Are we done? I'm going to fact and fiction. Miigwech.